Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our second webinar on telecommunications and technology. This is the second webinar in a series of 3 webinars exploring the topic. Our first webinar discussed future of work issues as they impact the Asian American community and other underserved communities. We are excited to be talking about digital inclusion and literacy today. This week is our Dispel the Digital Myth Week of Action. Too often, people studying the demographics of internet usage wrongly assume that the Asian American community is uniformly connected to the internet. Although we lack ethnicity disaggregated data about the rates of internet access and degrees of digital literacy, significant disparities in poverty, educational attainment, and English proficiency exist within our communities, and the digital divide impacts our communities every day. During this week, we want to raise awareness about the importance of digital inclusion and literacy. So get your communities connected. Use your newsletter, post on community bulletin boards, go to community events and places where people may gather to share information about ways to tackle the digital divide. Uplift the work of local organizations, libraries, and programs in your area that provide computer training, free internet access, and more to get our communities connected. Thank you to so many of our partners who are already doing this work every day. And also share your stories in person and online. Use our photo template to share your stories around the digital divide, digital inclusion, and digital literacy. If you're online, you can also join us on Twitter and Facebook with hashtag Dispel the Digital Myth. Our social media toolkit includes the photo templates as well as sample posts, shareable graphics, and more. And you can find the links to those resources on this slide. So what does digital inclusion and literacy look like for the Asian American community and other communities of color? How do we better understand the issue? What solutions should our communities be pushing for within industry and government to address these issues? These questions will be explored in this webinar. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. We will have Q&A at the end, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the questions yourself. If you have questions during the presentations, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. I will repeat these instructions once we get to Q&A. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. Today's webinar will be moderated by KJ Bakchi, who is the Senior Counsel for Telecommunications, Technology, and Media at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. KJ has broad experience providing counsel and policy advice for elected members at the local, state, and federal levels. He worked as legislative counsel at the DC City Council and for former Congressman Mike Honda. He's drafted legislation in a variety of areas, including juvenile justice, immigration, and consumer protection. Through various roles, KJ has developed programs, trainings, and conversations to embolden and empower the AAPI community in civic participation. And we are also joined by 4 great colleagues in the space. Angela Siefer is the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Angela has been working in the field we now call digital inclusion since 1997. She has helped physically set up computer labs in underserved areas, manage broadband conferences, conducted research, managed digital inclusion programs, assisted with the Department of Commerce's Broadband Adoption Toolkit, testified before a U.S. Senate subcommittee, and more. In 2015, Angela helped found the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. A portfolio of her written work is available at angelasiefer.com, and Government Technology Magazine named Angela one of the top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers of 2019. Next, we have Francella Ochillo, who is the Executive Director of Next Century Cities, previously the Vice President of Policy and General Counsel for the National Hispanic Media Coalition. Francella is a digital rights advocate who is committed to expanding access for unserved and underserved communities. Francella has worked on a variety of technology and telecommunications issues with a specific focus on assessing the impact of policy proposals on marginalized communities. Having worked for more than a decade with government and public interest organizations, she understands the challenges associated with getting various stakeholders to agree on connectivity solutions. Francella helps policymakers and lawmakers understand how broadband access can change socioeconomic outcomes and revitalize communities. It motivates her work to ensure that state and local leaders are given every opportunity to resolve their own connectivity issues and have a voice in shaping federal policies. Next, we have Hart Clements, who serves as a legislative assistant to Senator Patty Murray in Washington, working on digital inclusion, budget, agriculture, housing, and fisheries policy. Prior to joining the senator's office in January 2018, she worked as the state and local campaigns coordinator at Emily's List and as an organizer on the Hillary for America presidential campaign. Karin Smoly is our final speaker, and Karin is the director of Spectrum Community Impact at Charter Communications. Karin has more than 15 years of professional experience in sales, nonprofit fundraising, and program management. Much of her early career focused on addressing issues for women and children through her work at Junior Achievement and the International Rescue Committee. In 2011, Karin transitioned into corporate social responsibility with WWE Inc. While at WWE, she created programs with Susan G. Komen and Pearson Education that enriched the lives of women and children. Continuing her passion of building programs and engaging partners, she currently serves as Director, Community Impact at Charter Communications, where she oversees Spectrum Digital Education and Spectrum Employee Community Grants, as well as in-kind donations. So thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today.
Thanks for that introduction, Bessie, and good afternoon, everyone. The model minority myth contributes to the false narrative that all Asian Americans are well integrated, well connected, and well resourced. Yet those of us who simply live the Asian American existence understand that such an experience is not true for the entirety of our diverse community. A community that contains members with limited English proficiency, lower educational attainment, and lower household incomes. These indicators that illustrate a digital divide within our community are why we at AAJC work to preserve and expand equal technology access for Asian American communities. Digital inclusion and literacy are becoming an important part of everyday life. With technological innovation comes a reliance on digital connections to complete important tasks such as signing up for healthcare, paying bills, or submitting school loan applications. We are proud to partner with Spectrum on a number of webinars that focus on telecommunication and technology issues as they impact not only the Asian American community, but all vulnerable communities and communities of color. Our last webinar focused on the future of work as we plan for the evolution of the workplace. Today's webinar focuses on critical issues that impact millions of residents across the country, namely digital inclusion and digital literacy. We're excited to present this webinar in the middle of our week of action entitled Dispel the Digital Myth, where we use social media channels to dispel the myth that all Asian American communities are digitally connected and have comprehensive digital literacy. Join us in our efforts by signing our petition at bit.ly/DTDM forum. What do we mean by digital inclusion? We mean those activities that are necessary to ensure that all individuals and communities, including the most disadvantaged, have access to and use of information and communication technologies. Separately but related, digital literacy means the ability to use information and communication technologies to find, evaluate, create, and communicate information, requiring both cognitive and technological skills. We'll hear more about that from our speakers today. But as you listen to today's webinar, ask yourself if both of these concepts apply to every member of your local community. Today, we're lucky to hear not only from the advocates and frontline activists who ensure that no vulnerable person will be left behind when it comes to digital access, but also from a congressional staffer who will speak to us about legislation that takes aim directly at this issue. We're also fortunate today to have a speaker from Charter who will discuss grant opportunities for those who wish to tackle these communities in our own communities. Without any further delay, let's start off our program by welcoming Angela Siefer from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Go ahead, Angela.
Hey, thanks everyone. I'm super excited to be joining you all. I'm sitting here in Columbus, Ohio, so a little remote from some of the DC efforts, but that's kind of how we like it to be. NDIA's membership tend to be spread across the United States. We got started about 5 years ago. We are community-based organizations, nonprofits, housing authorities, local governments. They are what we call our affiliates, and they're the ones that are working on digital inclusion. And there was that definition that was provided to you earlier. that gets at what is digital inclusion. And so we're going to come back to that in a sec. So we created NDIA 5 years ago because there was this gap. So these efforts are going on all over across the United States where folks are trying to figure out how their neighbors, the folks that they serve, their communities can have access to the internet and have access to technology while getting, not only surviving day to day, but thriving day to day. So we represent them, and so we help them with the peer-to-peer kind of network of understanding what's going on, looking for strategies that work well, but then also being the place where policy happens. So we all know that policy is how one can make change on a larger kind of scale, and so that's important to the work that we do. So scrolling down a couple of slides, there's a map of our affiliates, and those affiliates are about 400 strong. They're in 44 states, and we welcome all to join us. It is free to join. It's really a place for peer-to-peer sharing. So as per the definition earlier, there's definitions of digital literacy, digital equity, digital inclusion. And one of the things the NDIA did when we get started is define digital equity and digital inclusion because there weren't definitions of those things. So we define digital equity as individuals and communities having information technology capacity for full participation. And so when we say society, democracy, economy, so really everything that we do today. These definitions are on our website. In kind of a, you think about, wow, what have we done? And what successes have we had? These definitions have been proven to be incredibly valuable because it gives us all a starting point for our conversations. So then if we move down to digital inclusion, this is more the how. We think of digital equity as the goal, and digital inclusion is what are those activities that are going to get us to digital equity. And so the activities that we tend to focus on are the first four: the affordable home broadband, appropriate devices, digital literacy, and tech support. And so the organizations on the ground that are addressing digital equity might address one of these, might do all of them, and oftentimes it is in partnership with other organizations in their communities. So next slide is who doesn't have internet? At NDIA, we don't collect our own data. We use the census data for a large source for the most part. And what that tells us is that, next slide, 20 million households don't have home broadband. And so we're intentionally not using the term access, we're using the term home broadband in terms of who has subscriptions at home. And the census, when they're referring to this, they're talking about DSL, cable, fiber, satellite, mobile, like nothing at all, right? 20 million households have nothing. So I don't use just the term access because in the United States that tends to refer to the availability of access. So is it present for you to go get a subscription to? And in the US, of course, you all know we have a problem with rural communities not having that physical availability to those networks. But next slide, of that 20 million, 15 million are in urban areas and 5 million are in rural areas. So most of the population in the United States that doesn't have access in their home, it's not because those physical wires and wireless isn't there, it's mostly because they can't afford it and they don't have the digital literacy skills. So those are challenging issues to address, but those are the things that our affiliates are addressing. In the next slide, the piece that we've seen that overlays those is poverty. So this slide has to be read carefully because there's multiple numbers in it. But if you look at like the rural one, of 5 million unconnected households in rural census tracts, 56% have household incomes of less than $35,000. So most of the folks in rural areas who don't have internet have it because poverty is an issue. Same thing with urban, right? It's 61%. So that helps us draw attention to the fact that we have issues with the affordability of home broadband and with digital literacy skills, because poverty, of course, is also connected to education. So what is the solution? In the US, the solutions are local. We don't have funding sources. Next slide, please. We don't have a national plan. So on the upside, this is great because each community is different. Of all these customized solutions. On the downside, there's no money. There's no funding for this work, right? So that is super hard. In the US, what we see is in certain communities, there will be really strong digital inclusion communities and coalitions. And in other communities, folks might be working on the issue, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. And a lot of times that top-down attention can get folks to talk to each other. The funding issue is a huge issue. A big challenge for digital inclusion programs is that they end up needing to find funding that serves a purpose of why one has broadband. So say the program is about workforce development, so there's funding for workforce development, but before you can help someone find a job, they first need an email address, right? They first need to know how to be comfortable with a computer. There's not funding for that kind of comfort and that kind of digital literacy training, nor is there funding for, let's make sure people actually have internet at home so that they're not having to come into the library, find sources of free Wi-Fi whenever it is that they need to connect. So that's a policy issue that NDIA is working on. We have next slide, we have multiple online resources for that kind of on the ground work. 3 of them are our guidebooks. We have a digital inclusion startup manual. This is very much a 101. It has examples. It addresses the low-cost home internet, public internet, low-cost devices, digital literacy training, and tech support. And it tells you where to find data in order to make your case. Then the second one is our discount internet guidebook. So there are a few internet service providers, including Spectrum, that have discount internet offers for eligible populations. And so the guidebook explains how the offers work, what are some other low-cost internet options, and it includes a full list of all the offers. And then the last one is our digital inclusion guidebook. So this is how to get a coalition started, who to invite, and how to set goals. The coalitions are really important because they can draw attention, they can raise the awareness of the issue, and often identify funding sources that hadn't been identified previously. Next slide. Our digital inclusion Trailblazers is our honor roll of local government working on digital inclusion. So when we first started at NDIA, we thought it was mostly going to be libraries and nonprofits. And then the surprise to our party was local government. So we were fascinated by that and started to dig into it more. And it turns out another organic effort occurring is in local governments because they see the disparity, right? They see that their community members don't have access to the internet. So the Trailblazers initiative of ours has indicators. So we ask questions of the local government such as, do you have free public Wi-Fi? Do you have staff that focus on digital inclusion? Do you have funding for digital literacy programs? Are you working within the coalition? Are you conducting research? All of those types of issues. And it has really helped to elevate the work of those who are doing it and help other cities, because crazy as it sounds, they all feel competitive towards each other. So it helps them to have a focus on how it is that they can raise their digital inclusion efforts. Next slide. NDIA is a community of practitioners, academics, and advocates. So the practitioners are the folks we tend to draw a lot of our work from, but we also have academics, we also have advocates, and they very much are a community. At our last conference, we have an annual conference every year, and at the last conference, folks were talking about it being a movement. And I think that totally resonated with a lot of the attendees there because the work is very grassroots, it's very local, but then when you come together to share that, it's quite empowering. Next slide. So we are in Portland, April 7th to the 9th. We will, of course, welcome you to join us. All of these resources that I've been talking about and information about the conference are all on our website. So we would love to have you as part of our community. And then the last slide is just a note that we do policy work, right? So that is a big part of who we are. We recognize that our affiliates are on the ground doing that day-to-day, interacting with individuals, kind of big work, and then our job is to support their work. The last slide is just the link on how to participate and join us. And then often, real quick, I like to just kind of fly through these last slides. So if we could just be like boom, 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 because it gives you an indication of who NDIA's members are. that they are all around the U.S., that they are cities, that they are nonprofits, they are housing authorities, they are computer refurbishers, some are teaching digital literacy, some are helping folks find access in their homes, some are finding access in public locations, but they all have this, this desire to make sure that we lift folks up with this incredibly powerful tool that is the internet. And this is this last photo is probably my favorite photo, the one with the two boys sitting outside the library, because what would you do to get access to the internet? Would you drag your PC or have your mom drag your PC outside the library in order to get access to the internet? Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate your presentation, Angela. Let's turn it over now to Francella Ochillo from Next Century Cities.
Hi there, you guys. I am so inspired by Angela's presentation that I'm going to follow up with some slides to supplement some of the things that I'm going to share today. But I do want to make sure that everyone who is listening to this webinar, whether it's live or dialing in later, thinks about what are your action items and the fact that you have the power to do something. I think a lot of the times about when we talk about the digital divide, that it means different things to different people. And very often, for the people, some of the populations that Angela described, if you were to look and see who's disconnected in different cities, if you're in New York, it's approximately 30% of low-income households that have no broadband access at home. When you're in Kansas, it's actually around 45%. If you're in California, it's around 40%. And what is the common denominator in all of these places is poverty. And the truth is that aside from being close to the poverty line, the digital divide disproportionately impacts communities of color. When we think about what does that really mean, when we distill it down into what does that mean in my household, very often I do want to always point out that if you are suffering from the digital divide, very often the households that we're talking about don't know anything different. They learn to make do. And the idea of not having certain digital access is something that people find ways to work around. They might think about it as an insurmountable obstacle that might put some natural limitations on what they can do and what they can be. But I think very often we have to look at this from different frameworks, because if you are suffering from it, it looks different than if you are the policymakers that are tasked with coming up with solutions. From Next Century Cities, we are a member organization of over 200 communities from coast to coast, including 40 states, and all of our members are united in their commitment to creating broadband solutions for their residents. Our objective is to make sure that every single resident in every single community in the United States has access to reliable, affordable broadband. And so what does that mean when we think about how that actually trickles down into our asks for each community, and what our jobs as citizens is to actually move that process along? So when we're thinking about the different things that cities are doing to address the digital divide, very often it starts with trying to diagnose the problem. Very often in cities, in my travels, one thing I've observed is that when we're looking at cities that are highly connected, we are usually thinking about places that have higher home values, higher salaries, more opportunities, because they're very often working in knowledge-based economies, versus communities that are working in goods and services-based economies that essentially they might be a little bit further behind, but there seems to be more opportunities when they have more access. What does that mean for communities that are still struggling for access? Very often they are not only trying to diagnose the problem, but to identify who is most impacted and what are going to be the next steps. So when we're looking at who is most impacted, especially thinking about it from a lens of Asian American communities are actually, compared to other communities of color, they fare better than their counterparts. In general, Hispanic and African American communities lag behind, and tribal communities remain the most disconnected populations. But one thing that I always want to point out is that if you are part of that 15% of the Asian American community that is not connected and maybe not even counted, that is of no comfort that there are more people who are connected than you. And I think that it's important for us to always point out that the frustrations and the obstacles don't change just because there's a smaller number of people that are struggling with that issue. So when we think about how do we actually empower communities to do something, very often it is important for us to actually take action in our communities by actually saying what exactly is the problem and what you want to offer as solutions. If we are waiting for city governments and city council members and people who are commissioning reports to go and diagnose the problems in our communities, many people will still be waiting and wanting for connectivity solutions without answers. And it's really important for us to think about what is within your control, even if that means to say, we need more laptops at our schools. We need better connectivity in our libraries. It is really important that we are articulating and ask for what you need to actually improve connectivity in your community. Another thing that I want to point out is that when the people who are disconnected do not have the luxury of being able to opine about statistics, but what they can tell you is their stories. And that is something that is more important than any other thing that I've ever seen in a policy docket, is to be able to actually elevate the stories and the impact of how these things trickle down and paralyze communities. The truth is that we know that in communities that people have access, they're going to have better educational outcomes, they're going to have better jobs, higher salaries, higher home values, and actually a meaningful opportunity to participate in our democracy. And if the alternative, if that is true, then that also means that those who are left behind are not going to have the same opportunities. Well, it doesn't make sense that we just hope that that gets elevated in a policy document in the abstract. We actually have to take control of that narrative and make sure that we're elevating those stories. So where do you elevate them? That might mean that you participate in an FCC docket where you go to the agency that actually has a congressional mandate to make sure that every single American has connectivity or at least some sort of access to high-speed broadband. Maybe that means that you elevate it to your city council and tell them your stories to make sure that they actually make it into the public ecosphere. Another thing that you can do is to document your stories online. It's really important that advocates like AAJC actually have work product and stories to choose from when they are elevating policy asks, because the way that we help illuminate why we're saying something is for good policy making is by saying these are the stories and this is the real impact on real people. Another thing that I want to make sure that people are always thinking about is that there is no better storyteller than you. I think that it's important that when we think about how we tell our stories and the impact, the data matters, and not just what is wrong, but what you want to make it right. Very often, policy advocates, we are very often stuck in a reactionary posture where we're always reacting to say whether or not something is good or bad policy. But I always think that the best place to dream is when you don't have a budget, you don't have limitations, you just decide this is what our idea of connectivity looks like in our community. And it's really important that we actually articulate those messages proactively rather than waiting for some sort of government mandate or rulemaking procedure to open, that we are actually offering those solutions. At Next Century Cities, one thing that we do that's really important about supporting broadband connectivity is that we're always thinking about ways to support local government's efforts to either create their own networks, build partnership solutions with networks that might exist but not be serving all communities. And also, we're always looking to make sure that we are a neutral resource for community leaders to actually ask really hard questions about the how and the why. Some of the questions that Angela teed up before about digital inclusion, digital access, and actual adoption, those are two very different things. And at Next Century Cities, we're constantly thinking about, even if you have broadband access available to you, what are those barriers to adoption to actually get you to be able to subscribe? Do we have competitive networks? Do people have choice? Can they actually afford to get online? And those are really important questions that we can't always get the granular answers that we hope for, but where we fill in the blanks with those is when we actually have storytelling where people actually give their own accounts of what's happening in their own community. And then finally, we think a lot about getting city leaders to think about digital inclusion at every phase of a network build. It is not enough to think about digital equity as an afterthought. It is not enough to come back and say, we built this great network, we have all these amazing partners, but there's 30% of these populations sprinkled around the cities that still have no access. And in fact, a lot of the times when we talk about the digital divide does not only apply to rural and hard to reach areas, very often they're urban communities that are right under our noses. So we need to do a better job of being able to articulate our own stories, to be able to actually document those in a public way so that we can elevate them into our policy asks. When we walk away from this webinar, I always want people to know that wherever you are in this ecosystem, you have power. We have the ability to change whether or not someone gets connected and how soon that actually happens. So I encourage each of you to think about what levers of power you have in your community. Sometimes that means actually reaching out to anchor institutions and other trusted resources to partner on elevating the issue and actually coming up with action items. Sometimes that means that you personally are going to need to reach out to government officials to say, what is your ask? What can we do? And to actually demand results. And more than anything, making sure that we're holding people accountable, because this is something that might not seem urgent right now, but for the 15% of the Asian American community that is essentially operating in the dark, having to take the day off to change your license, not being able to know where to vote, not being able to get information in real time. And even if you have information, it might not be the same information at the same time as somebody in Miami, Florida. That is unacceptable. And so we need to be thinking about ways that we can actually do something small or large to get transformative results.
Great, thank you, Francella. I'm now excited to turn it over to Hart Clements from the Office of Senator Patty Murray to talk to us about the legislative options and solutions we have to address this important issue.
Hi guys, and thank you AAJC for getting this convened and including our office. Really appreciate it. I wanted to start off just building on both what Angela and Francella touched on. You know, the reason that my boss, Senator Murray, she represents Washington State, first got interested in this was to better understand how technology is impacting families and communities, you know, right now in Washington State. She is the ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions team. And on all of those areas, we see digital exclusion carrying real harm, you know, whether that's from telemedicine or the homework gap or, you know, the upcoming census, which will be done online for the first time. There's a real impact when we're leaving communities off in the digital divide. And so this really comes down to a civil rights issue when you look at the communities most impacted. We've talked about the low income factor being kind of the through line, but you know, it's capturing a lot of communities of colors, people with disabilities, rural communities, formerly incarcerated individuals with limited English proficiency, seniors. And so from my boss's perspective, when this issue is coming more into national attention, and as the divide grows, as technology speeds ahead, you know, it was pretty disconcerting to realize that there really is no federal funding right now dedicated towards this issue. We are, you know, appropriating billions of dollars to build out broadband infrastructure, but we are not focusing on the digital inclusion side, you know, which again is exacerbating harm now. And so from my boss's perspective, this was a situation of it's not going to do us much good to build all these roads and highways, but not make sure that our communities have access to a car, know how to drive it safely and effectively. So that's what led us kind of down the road of writing the Digital Equity Act. And we work very closely with NDIA, with Next Century Cities, AAJC, with a bunch of partners to try to think about this and find out what would make the most sense from a federal framework and engagement. And the final product, it would be 2 new grant programs both administered by National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. One grant program would be administered at the state level. The thought being here, we want states to be able to have that top-down view of which communities could use this assistance, and to also make sure that we're spreading resources to communities that might not do as well in a competitive national grant process, given the funds and resources that it takes to participate. But the other grant program would be just a competitive grant program administered nationally that localities, organizations, coalitions could apply for money to carry out digital inclusion programs and exercises. These two programs would be totaling about $1.4 billion over 5 years. And the idea here is to have a locally driven federalist approach on an issue where, as Francella and Angela mentioned, communities really need to be the ones identifying what their community needs. Digital inclusion looks very different from community to community, and from the federal perspective, that's really tough for us to craft a federal program when it needs that granularity and that diversity. So this is really going to be led by groups on the ground and by local communities. So the bill was introduced in the Senate in September. The Senate bill, if you're looking for the number, is S1167. On the House side, it was just introduced in September, and the bill number is HR 4486. Just by ways of an update as to kind of where this bill is right now, on the Senate side, we have 17 Democratic co-sponsors, and on the House side, we just had 3 members of the Energy and Commerce Committee introduce. Those were Representative Jerry McNerney of California, Representative Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, and Representative Yvette Clark of New York. And the idea with this is, we want to be making the argument for this kind of bill to go along with any infrastructure package that Congress is going to consider. This is a new issue for a lot of our members, and so something we've realized pretty early is that there is an education gap among elected officials at the national level about this issue and about how it's directly impacting communities now on the ground, as well as a lot of organizations, and NDIA has been a leader on this. A lot of organizations and communities are already taking action. They're just doing it with very little resources and very little dedicated funding. And so the argument that Senator Murray is making and that we've been pushing across both the Senate and the House is that anytime that Congress is going to be appropriating, again, these billions of dollars to build out and connect communities, we need to be also having an eye on the inclusion pieces that are significant and we think going to become ever more important. I wanted to touch on just an example of a type of project that is in Washington State that Senator Murray has gotten to see and talk with this group, and I thought might be a good example of something that we would love this bill to be able to fund. Seattle is actually a very unique situation in which they're one of the few cities that is dedicating funding to a grant program where they'll give money to groups to carry out digital inclusion activities. They do a lot of data collection. They're definitely a leader, and they helped kind of inspire this bill too. And one entity that does a lot of work is the Seattle Housing Authority. Angela mentioned, the difficulty of just getting people an email address, and Seattle Housing Authority was realizing as they went digital that they needed to, that many of the residents actually just didn't have an email and they were unable to communicate with them or help them sign up for services. And so they implemented a new thing of anytime a new resident joins them, they sign them up for an email address and help them kind of take some steps through, find out what digital inclusion, whether it's a digital literacy course or connecting them with hotspots through the public library. They've become a real conduit now for the residents. And another specific example within Seattle Housing Authority is a Somali Family Task Force. And this is a group that's doing culturally appropriate digital literacy courses. So this was actually from a group of Somali women that live in the housing authority coming together and wanting to be able to get online to do things like access their children's homework grades and to be able to use the internet for remote business or to be able to just get up to date in a new community. And they actually had this class taught by an imam, and it was in Somali, and it was an example of how this community identified their own need, was able to secure funding, and was able to do a really specific and tailored program through that. And that is the type of thing that we want to be able to support at the federal level. And so how you guys can help, this bill is a big priority for my boss and something that we're going to keep trying to bang the drum of making sure people better understand how digital inclusion and digital divide generally is impacting their communities. And so NDIA and Shelby are leading a coalition to help rally outside support. You can go to digitalequityact.org. You can also contact your representatives to talk about your support for this legislation, but also even more importantly, to share stories of your work on the ground, of things that you're already doing or needs that you're already seeing. And, I know one example that we're really watching closely is going to be the census. And so how do we make sure that we are not letting anyone be undercounted or left out in that process, which again is going online this year. I'm also happy if anyone has specific questions or would like more information about the legislation, I'm happy to talk with anyone, and we are going to keep fighting to be able to make sure that this can get passed and be able to help all the work that's going on the ground.
Thanks so much, Hart. We'll definitely have a few questions about how folks can show their support for the legislation, from their own community perspective. Before I turn it over to Karin, I wanted to invite Francella to kind of give us examples of some local projects that you've seen through your capacity as working with Next Century Cities.
Yeah, and some of these examples are actually things that some of them I've learned about before, just over the past 4 years. And so I think all the time when I'm actually trying to remind people that people have power to change outcomes is when I think about how the Wi-Fi on Buses initiative started. Wi-Fi on Buses many years ago, when kids who were in West Virginia, there were actually teachers who were frustrated with kids not being able to do their math homework. And so they reached out to the Center for Rural Strategies, who actually helped orchestrate one of the first Wi-Fi on Buses programs. And it was it was a basic program where they decided certain communities were going to get it on certain days. And they essentially figured out a way how to put Wi-Fi on a bus and literally said, you're on Tuesdays, you're on Wednesdays. And basically this was to make sure that kids in this community could do geometry and calculus and all sorts of things that they wanted their students to be able to be competitive. In Detroit, when you think about the Detroit Community Technology Program, that is something that actually turns everyday residents into digital ambassadors who every single week are connecting households in Detroit who have never had access to internet of any kind to internet at home for the first time. And that program was so successful, they actually replicated it at the Point in the Bronx, where they essentially started out as a community center where they had sports and music and turned their coaches into digital ambassadors to make sure that people could find ways to get connected. Also, I want to remind people that the idea of librarians sharing Wi-Fi hotspots, when they actually started with that program, very often it was mixed in different parts of the country. Sometimes it was used in rural areas to connect people to university networks. Sometimes it was used because the libraries were the only place where people could get reliable access. So even if there was access in the area, the library was the place where you could actually have a consistent connection. And now you have places like Boston, Dallas, New York, lots of other places that aren't just letting you check out Wi-Fi hotspots, but they actually loan them to students for the entire semester, and so that their entire family can get connected. So I say these examples to you to remind you that all of those projects started with people who cared. And so those started with people who felt like, I have power, I can do something, and that led to change.
I think that's a great segue to introduce our next speaker, Karen Smoly from Charter Communications, who can talk about the grant opportunities for local organizations that do want to, take a stab at this really important issue.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I appreciate getting the opportunity to speak to all of you. So as mentioned, my name is Karen Smoly. I am at Charter Spectrum. So we're just going to quickly give you an overview because I know people are calling in around the country, and so some of you may not be familiar with Charter. We are locally known in market as the brand Spectrum. We're your TV, phone, internet, and mobile connector. We are the second largest cable operator in the U.S. We are in 41 states with 26 million residential and business customers. And we have about 92,000 employees. And so many of you probably, if you're familiar with us, it's because you know the brand Spectrum. If you're not, it's because you're probably not one of our service markets. We have New York, LA, Dallas, most of the state of Ohio, most of the state of North Carolina, Orlando, Tampa, Austin, just to name a few of some of the major markets that we operate in. Next slide, please. So I run our Spectrum Digital Education program, which launched in 2017. So to take a step back, some of you may have been familiar with Time Warner Cable. 3 years ago, Charter Communications acquired Time Warner Cable, merged the companies together, rebranded it Spectrum as the product out in the marketplace. And at the time, Charter only had one philanthropic initiative. Since that time, 3 years later, we've launched Spectrum Digital Education, which is what I'm going to talk about here, which I manage, as well as our Spectrum Employee Community Grants, which is another initiative that I launched this year and also manage. So under Spectrum Digital Education, since we are a phone, internet, cable, mobile provider, it seemed to make a lot of sense from a philanthropic perspective that if we are going to focus areas of giving back in the communities where our customers and employees live and work, we want to do that in a space that makes the most sense for Charter Spectrum as a business and as a company. So we launched Spectrum Digital Education in 2017 and made $1 million commitment in funding. And then we also gave the opportunity for those that received funding from us to provide us with public service announcements that we would air on our network. So it did extremely well. And again, the idea behind the program is we wanted to make sense, but we also know that there are a lot of great organizations, like many of you on this call, that are doing amazing work, that are bridging that digital divide. And so we wanted to give you all the funding to be able to do that, because that's your wheelhouse, that's your core competency. And so we wanted to partner with all of you to do the great work that you're doing. Next slide, please. So the program is now in its third year, which is really exciting. We launched the RFP over the summer. We do that for about 5 weeks over the summer. And then we have a committee that selects the grantees. Then in November, we announce those. And in December, we award the funding. So we just had our third round of funding that we announced. We met our $1 million commitment. And we renewed that earlier this year with a $5 million commitment. And we just awarded grants this year, and we will be awarding grants again next year with the same time frame that we would open the RFP up in July of 2020, 4 or 5 weeks of requests for proposal submissions, and then the committee reviews them. And then we make the announcements, and the funding gets delivered to our grantees, and then the programs get to continue on. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the grant recipients for the first 2 years. So it was $1 million. So 40 nonprofits across the country. What's really exciting is that we had a nice mix of organizations that are very local, only supporting one community within a city, or one very focused area within maybe a state. And then we also had some national partners. So we're really looking at the work that's being done, less about kind of the far reaching that it has, but what will the impact be? And like I said, we just announced our third round of funding. This year's program, there were 21 financial recipients and 10 laptop recipients. So this year we did enhance the program and distribute laptops to organizations as well. Next slide, please. So just to give a snapshot, we do some kind of impact numbers to see how many beneficiaries of funding. So for the first go round, the first year of funding awarding, this was some of the statistics that we were able to gather. We're in the process of collecting those from our second class of grantees, and we'll have that by the end of the year. And so we're just really proud of the work that we have been able to do with our amazing partners. And then we won't go into the video. And then lastly, if you want to find out more information, you can certainly be in touch with me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Having managed the program now for a few years, I'm available to answer questions. If you go to the next slide, my contact information is on there. And again, so thankful for the opportunity to speak and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you, Angela, Francella, Hart, and Karin, for sharing your work and the different opportunities to engage and take action. So we are going to move into Q&A. If you're interested in asking a question, there's a few ways you can do that. You can either use the chat box or the questions box to type and send your question, or you can raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. So again, you can either use the chat box or the questions box to type in and send your question, or you can raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. And we'll pause for a few seconds so that people can get their questions in.
Is it that you have to apply everywhere? Can I ask now? Okay. Hi, Karin, I just had a question for you about your grant funding program. And I think it is really exciting that you guys are focusing on organizations that have a local impact. Is that something that's a one-time award, or is it something that once people actually get awarded that they can apply for renewals?
Great question. Thank you. Yes. You can keep applying. So we have 3 organizations who have just in the third round of funding have received the third round of funding. So we have 3 organizations that have been with us for 3 years, which is amazing. One organization is in North Carolina, one organization is in Kansas City, and the other one is in St. Louis, Missouri. So it's the 2 only requirements for the program is that you must be a registered 501c3 and you must be operating in Spectrum's territory service footprint. That said, one of our LULAC, one of the organizations that we work with, which is based out of DC, we don't operate in DC, but as long as the money is being programmatically implemented in a market that we do work in, then you qualify. So some are so local that they operate and the funding is right there in that town or city. Others, they have a larger footprint and we just require that it be implemented in our service territory. But those are the only 2 requirements. And like I said, you can keep reapplying for funding, which is great.
Thank you. And we have another question. So for organizations that don't currently work on tech and telecom issues, but are interested in engaging more in the space, do you all have advice for ways to advocate around digital inclusion and literacy as they gradually build their capacity? I think this is a question for all of our speakers.
This is Angela. I think it matters whether or not that organization is local or national. So if the organization is local, then a way to advocate is to support the digital inclusion programs that do exist in that local community. And actually, it's very similar nationally, then support the organizations who are doing that work. Being available for things like, yes, we'll sign on to letters, the things that, because it's not your core mission, you don't want to put a lot of time into it, but you can do the things that don't require a lot of time, like signing on to support letters. That's the kind of thing you can do more so nationally. Locally, it's more helping make the connections for those folks and elevating the awareness around the issue with and for them.
And also, if I could just add something to what Angela was saying, because I want to do a plug for National Digital Inclusion Week, because I heard about it before I had actually met Angela or known about NDIA. And I think that that is a great example of a nationwide campaign that can also be, whether it's online, in person, however you want to contribute, that doesn't cost any money, but does a really good job of raising awareness for however you want to tailor the issue. So I think that it's really important to be able to plug into those types of things where you can just actually have an issue that is localized for you, whatever you want people to know about your needs and what your community, how it could be improved with digital access. And the National Digital Inclusion Week that happens every year, I believe it's around the first week of April. Angela, please correct me. I'm telling you the wrong date. I'm sorry, not April. Your convention is in April. Your Inclusion Week is in October. But I think it's really important.
That's correct. Thank you. That's super. Thank you, Francella. I probably should have put that in the slides, actually. The information about Digital Inclusion Week is on the website. And yes, it is an easy way to help elevate awareness.
And since some of you mentioned Census, there's a question. Are there efforts underway to help tech illiterate folks navigate potential misinformation online, especially regarding the census and elections?
Yeah, that's a big issue right now. And it is happening in those local communities. And there could be others on the line who have better quick points to resources. Otherwise, I can grab those and send them to you all later.
And just to tee up to follow up on what Angela just said, I know that local libraries are trying to set up essentially like safe places for people to fill out census forms. They aren't all going to have like enough staffing to be able to walk people through it and answer questions. But I do know that obviously there are local organizations, whether it's churches, schools, that are doing some translation efforts. And then also actual municipalities are setting up kiosks in different places where they can have the information around the census available in different languages. Specifically in LA County, they actually partnered with a lot of local organizations to deploy over 900 kiosks, which are either laptops, iPads, things like that, that are available at different places throughout the community to make sure that people who don't have access at home have somewhere that they can actually submit their answers to the questionnaire.
And the only thing I'd add there would just be the, especially when it comes to census outreach, this is fully, locally driven. So anything you can do as organizations on the ground to plug into those efforts and uplifting it, the digital inclusion piece of it and making sure that, the organizers on the ground are well aware and however you can support them in that, this is going to be locally driven. Of course, that makes it much harder to organize at a larger scale. But that would be my only plug for an action item is to get involved now as those things and that planning is very well underway.
And for Advancing Justice AAJC, our messaging research shows that for the Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, the most trusted messengers when it comes to the census are friends and family. So it's so important for us, especially in tackling and addressing any misinformation, to make sure that friends and family have access to facts and the correct information when it comes to the census and elections. Well, with an eye on time, it looks like we do not have time for further questions, but we will share contact information for all of our speakers on the next slide. So I want to turn it over to KJ for some closing information to wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Bessie. I want to thank all our speakers today for bringing their insight and perspective into these critical issues. Thank you, Angela, Karen, Hart, and Francella. Our webinar, we really worked hard to make sure that we not only focus on identifying a problem, but also trying to find as many ways as we could to present solutions, whether it be from the local level and plugging into local digital inclusion actions, or applying for grants from Charter, from one of our partners, as well as calling into your local congressperson, your congress member, your senator, talking to them about supporting the Digital Equity Act. The Digital Equity Act is critical because it provides resources at the local level for individuals to take on these issues. And with Census right around the corner, the issues of digital inclusion and literacy are just so important. We want to remind folks again that gathering data on this issue as it impacts AAPI community is still a difficult area that AAJC has continued to focusing on. We're working with our partners, we're working with our allies in terms of trying to find ways to gather data around this issue. But while Census and other studies show that there are clear digital divide indicators, there's clearly a need within our community to address the issues of digital literacy and digital inclusion. The main action items that we want folks to take away today is, of course, sign up on our petition to become part of the Dispel the Digital Myth campaign, but also look toward the folks that spoke today on from NDIA, Next Century Cities, as well as the local grant program that Charter is putting on. We again can send all resources after today's program. I want to thank our speakers, and of course I want to thank my colleagues, Bessie Chan Smitham, who does a great job of bringing these webinars together, and to Livia Luan, our programs associate, who supports our work in the tech and telecom department. Let me now turn the program back over to Bessie to close us off.
All right, thank you everyone for tuning in today. As you know, this webinar is recorded and we'll send out the recording and presentation after this webinar. We'll also circulate a one-pager on the Digital Equity Act that Hart provided and additional information and slides from Francella. So as a reminder, this week is our Dispel the Digital Myth Week of Action. Are there local organizations, libraries, and programs in your area that provide computer training, free internet access, or other opportunities to get your community connected? If so, use your newsletter, post on community bulletin boards, and go to community events and places where people may gather to share this information. Also, share your stories about digital inclusion and literacy to dispel the digital myth about our communities. As Francella mentioned, there is no better storyteller than you, so share your story. And also, if you're on social media, check out our Twitter and Facebook for Dispel the Digital Myth content all week. We look forward to connecting with you again during our next Telecommunications and Technology webinar. And again, these webinars are possible through our partnership with Spectrum. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to all of our speakers.